Welcome, everybody. Well, everybody here and also everybody who's watching this on the DVD. I'd like to begin by saying a few things about the context of our meeting here tonight and about the purpose of these lectures and about what we're up to. So these lectures are actually being put on by the Esalen Center for Theory and Research. The Esalen Center for Theory and Research is an organization founded by Michael Murphy, who many of you may have heard of. He's the person who founded Esalen, which has been so important, an institution in our community. And one of the things that Mike Murphy likes to do is he's a scholar, and he convenes groups of scholars, people who are really deeply into their work and very competent, and he brings people together to discuss issues and themes that are not being discussed anywhere in academia. So he's sort of filling the need for discussing things that just don't fit into the academic context. And one of the conferences that we have going at Esalen, and it's been going on for quite a few years now, is a conference on reincarnation and on life after death. There's a group of scientists, particularly there's a group of them at the University of Virginia, I believe, who've been studying this issue for a long time. And in fact, there's a tradition of studying this issue of reincarnation and life after death scientifically, which goes back to William James and Frederick Myers and other people about 100 years ago or more. And there is an enormous amount of evidence, real, hard scientific evidence, which makes it very clear that in fact we do not die with the death of our bodies, and makes it extremely plausible that we reincarnate. Now, the issue of what happens to us after our body dies is an extraordinarily important issue. I mean, in some way, it's like the most important issue we could talk about. What happens to the personality? What happens to us? And what happens to the people we love when they die and they cease to function in our waking life? Where do they go? Where do we go? What happens? And the issue is immensely important to the whole structure of our civilization, because the fact that we believe that at the end of our physical existence, our personality ceases strongly affects our outlook on life. It affects our sense of ethics, right? And it profoundly affects our values, so that if we believe that at the end of our physical life, our personality dies, what's life for? What's it about? Right? It becomes nothing but an opportunity to gratify our emotional, intellectual, and physical needs for a short while before we're reduced to extinction. And that kind of attitude toward life and that kind of attitude towards ethics very much encourages the tide of consumerism under which we find ourselves buried. If, on the other hand, we do survive the death of our bodies, and if, on the other hand, we are involved in a sequence of reincarnations, which is somehow a part of the evolution of the universe, somehow part of the cosmogenesis of which we are a part, then our whole attitude towards ourselves and our whole attitude toward life has to change. The whole question of our destiny, the whole question of the meaning of our existence, and all of our attitudes towards ethics will change. And also, just think about this. Suppose we were to really come to believe that people's personalities do survive bodily death. And suppose that we were to find a way to regularly communicate with people who had died. What would that do to our property laws? This is really interesting, right? Who owns the property at that point, right? And who has the disposition over the affairs? So you can see this is a really profound issue. And remarkably enough, it is not being considered in any institution that we know of in the United States or in the world. As far as we've been able to figure out, the group of us who are doing work on this at Esalen are the only group of serious academics who are working to understand and to fathom the human destiny, the facts of our life, the profound nature of the human life cycle. So the seminar began about 7 or 8 years ago with people who were mainly scientists and were really trying to get a handle on the evidence. What is the evidence for life after death? And what is the evidence for reincarnation? And that went on for about 7 years. And in fact, the people in the conference at that time wrote a book called Irreducible Mind, which at least is an attempt to demonstrate conclusively, in fact, it does demonstrate, I think, conclusively, that there is something to the personality that's more than the body and that might survive. The book does at least that. But in general, all of us who've been involved in examining this data have come to the conclusion that it's simply a fact. It's a fact that we do incarnate more than once. And it's a fact that the personality that we form during our life does in fact survive the death of the body. And so we've stopped examining the evidence so much, and we've all changed our focus. And now our work is trying to say, okay, if this is true, how do we understand it? And so I've been working with the group for several years now as part of this effort to come up with a theory or a theoretical framework within which we can make sense of reincarnation and make sense of life after death. And also there are some other phenomena that come with it that we also need to understand. Now, if it is the case that we survive the death of our bodies, that has certain implications. In order for that to be true, it must be the case that our personalities, whatever we mean by that, but our personalities must somehow transcend our physical bodies. It must be possible for us to have intentions which modify what happens in our bodies, as they do, but also it must be possible for us to continue existing even when the physical body has died. That means, if that's the case, what manner of being are we? What kind of being can do that? So before I answer that question, let me look at some of the evidence that we have come to take as conclusive in suggesting that, in fact, the human life cycle does not end with the death of the physical body. So for one thing, there's the testament of every culture in history prior to the last 300 years. Every culture prior to ours assumed and knew that human beings lived after physical death. And most cultures had a very prominent place for dealing with the ancestors. People would have shrines to their ancestors. People would communicate with their ancestors. And we can't assume that these people were just somehow unenlightened or primitive. These were people who were genetically identical to us and at least as smart as we were. And throughout history, they had the experience that communing with ancestors was an effective activity. Now, another really interesting piece of evidence, and one that is perhaps the most scientifically conclusive, is the research that was done by Stevenson. I forget Stevenson's first name. Do I remember? Anyway, this guy Stevenson did research on what they call cases of the reincarnation type, or court. What they found was that there are a lot of children, very young children, who have vivid and detailed memories of previous lives. They'll start saying when they're 3 or 4 years old, oh, I don't really belong here. I belong in this other house. And my sister is named this, and my brother is named this, and my cat is named this. But in that lifetime, I was killed, I died in this way. And they have the whole story. And so Stevenson went out and began to interview these children. He found out that almost all of them claimed to have lived and died in the recent past and in geographical proximity. They weren't very far away. And so he went out and he started investigating these cases. And people said, well, I came from this town 20 miles away. He'd go there, and sure enough, he'd find the family to which they had belonged. And he'd find the cat with the same name, and the grandmother and the father, and the whole story matched. And on top of that, in many cases of this sort, the people involved had died very early and usually had died of violent deaths. And very frequently, there were birthmarks on the body that corresponded to the wounds that had killed the person. So, for example, one person had been shot through the throat with a shotgun or something, right? And whoever it was had gone through the head and out the back. Now the guy had a big birthmark on his neck, but then they took a look on his skull, and he also had birthmarks where all the exit wounds had been, right? So there are thousands of these cases, very, very carefully and meticulously documented. Right? In many cases, they got there very early on, before people had talked about it, and they were able to go to the other town before anybody could have found out. This happens. This is well documented scientifically. Right? This is very, very powerful evidence for reincarnation. Now, also, many of us have had past life memories, which don't count as evidential in the same way, but for those of us who've had them, they're very convincing. Now, also, we have evidence for ways in which the human personality can function independently of the body. So, for example, many, many people report out-of-body experiences. They report having the experience of leaving their body, looking down at their body, traveling around in a space very much like physical space, and so forth. This is a very common, not common, but this is a regular experience that many people have reported. And research has been done on this. It's a very well-documented phenomena. There's also lucid dreams. Many of us have had lucid dreams. Now, in lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences, in near-death experiences, what happens is that people experience themselves as fully conscious. They experience themselves as having the same memories that they had when they were awake. Right? They're the same personality that's been formed during life, and yet they are functioning independently of the human body. Very frequently, not frequently, but there are many well-documented cases in which people have had this experience while under anesthetic, and their brains are flatlined. There is no electrical activity happening in their brains at all, and yet they're able to report what happened in the operating room, what people were wearing, things that were said when they were under anesthetic, and so forth. So this is very powerful evidence that the human personality can function independently of the physical body. We also have a vast literature of communications from dead people through mediums. It's what Stuart used to call Uncle George. Right? Uncle George would come back and say things. Right? But the thing is, these are very, very impressive, well-documented cases in which a great deal of information is presented that could not have been known otherwise. It's controversial, but the evidence is there and powerful. For anyone who's had the experience, it can be very powerful. Now, we also have another kind of evidence for the personality transcending the body. And that is parapsychological evidence. So, for example, whatever we are, this being that we are that is capable of existing outside of the body, is also capable of influencing the body. So that as I am speaking to you and my vocal cords are operating, my body is forming the words that my consciousness intends. And we could regard this as a kind of psychokinesis, a way in which the personality, which is not exactly the body, is somehow influencing the body. But also, our personality is capable of interacting with the physical world directly and not through the medium of the body. Whatever it is that we are, we not only have the capacity to operate a body, but we also have the capacity in some way to have causal effects in the world around us that are not mediated through our bodies. There's been a tremendous amount of experimentation done using random number generators, where people will sit down in front of a random number generator, they will wish that there will be more ones than zeros, and in a statistically significant way there will be. Right? And this happens over and over again. Because it's electronic, they can do millions of trials and they get very statistically significant results.